Hello, guys. I hope you can hear me well. I know I don't look well. I just woke up. I've been on an unholy fast, and well, I'm unholy. I mean, I'm not fasting because of religious reasons. I just need to get this out of my chest, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I finally articulated something that I think is very important, and that's why I'm not eating. I have been like slaving at this for a couple of hours. Um, Lord have mercy if this is not to His glory. I wanted to speak about uh, a couple of things that are very near and dear to my heart. One of them is semiotics, symbols, and the other one is Christology, ecclesiology, the borders of the church, and the reason why the doctrine of hell is actually crucial. So I wanted to speak a little bit about Jonathan Peugeot. I think he's been an immense influence on me. He is partly the reason why I became an Orthodox Christian. I owe him a lot, and I think he's still doing a lot of good things and doing them from a really good place. My critique might not be to his liking, or he, in the sense that he might disagree with it, or maybe I'm being too excessive in my critique. Uh, and this is not me disavowing him at all. On the contrary, I think his work is crucial and very important. But I say all of these things because there are performative aspects that I think are somewhat unclear when it comes to, let's say, practicing the faith. And the philosophical articulation that people like Peugeot are doing sometimes feels a little bit like stumbling into the dark in order to rebuild robust Christian worldview, right? To not only, let's say, uh, entice people into Christianity, but actually to, let's say, popularize um, articulations that have been lost or that haven't been, let's say, fully fleshed out. So I see his work as doing that, as trying to do that. And this is not me invalidating his work. On the contrary, this is trying to, let's say, continue on that same direction, because I also recognize the need to flesh out, let's say, our theology in more granular and, let's say, explicit ways. So I'm going to read to you something that I wrote. Hopefully, it will not very long. It will not be very long and tiresome for you to hear it, or dull. So this is the hard line: symbols, Christology, the church, and hell. While I agree with Jonathan Peugeot when it comes to fractal patterns of reality and attention, my contention with his idea of symbolism is that the symbolic as he understands it is too high. I apologize if he already knows all of the things that I'm going to say, and I have some sense that he tries to take into account all of the points that I'm raising. I don't know if his solutions are ultimately satisfying or if he has addressed these things in a proper manner. Um, he equates symbolism with Christ as symbol in the world. This confuses Christ with the Father, unfortunately, and I will explain why. I'll give an example related to Christology, and this is also related to the philosophy of essentialism and somewhat tangentially related to nominalism and to the relationship between, let's say, images and what they image. So the cup of iniquity represents the unrepentant world. When God says he endures the vessels of wrath for the possibility of the incarnation and divinization, the vessels of wrath are collectively the cup of iniquity that makes creation as he wills it possible. Christ drinks the cup of iniquity symbolically in order to fully image how he incorporates human nature and images both God and man. So he incorporates human nature and images both God and man, but he also uses images to refer to this, which are, let's say, operating beyond the mystical aspect of this. He does so mystically and symbolically, but not both at the same time, or rather in the same manner. When Christ drinks the cup, symbolically speaking, he's mystically assuming human nature. He did that mystically during the incarnation, perhaps even prior to that. From these images and their distance to mystical or sacramental processes, you can also extrapolate theologically that what Orthodox priests say about God not willing man's damnation, damnation being distance from God, is both technically accurate in the sense that God does not want man to be damned, and also somewhat inaccurate in that God wills that freedom be in a constitutive sense, making sin and damnation possible. God does not want men to go to hell, but he wants hell to exist more because the possibility of hell safeguards the possibility of recovering paradise, of communion being restored. This is why he will endure vessels of wrath. God wills there to be hell and for men to fill it, which is painful for him, in order to respect man's dignity as a creature and allow communion to occur. So God wills that creation have the possibility of choosing sin. Hell is not a punishment meant for reform of the punished, but it is torment, it is just, and it is punishment. It's just not reform of the unrepentant. That's not the goal of hell. It is for safeguarding the elect. Don't let marshmallow Christianity rope you in. They say hell does not exist or God really doesn't will hell to be. No, 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 no. That doesn't make any sense. Symbols don't safeguard in themselves or equal the mystical processes they image or represent. That would imply that you could force God to appear during liturgy. Symbols express and support the mystical processes that God has already willed. That framing of symbols as vehicles respects the monarchy of the Father. Instead of making Christ equal to the Father, the monarchy of the Father is a concept in the Cappadocian Fathers that is very important to understand the Trinitarian relationships. It is also the only way to understand Christ's relationship to the Father, and it is also related to the somewhat wrong view of penal substitutionary atonement. The problem, again, for us Orthodox would be trying to overcorrect in the other direction and have a candies and rainbows idol of God, just because we ourselves cannot bear God to be God. So we have to be very careful not to counteract a heresy or a heretical idea with our own heresy. Symbols can participate in reality. In fact, they are a necessary ingredient for us, and we are called to image Christ. But the moment symbols set themselves up as reality itself, they end up becoming idols of God, painting Christ in a subversive light in relationship to his Father. Christ's ontological status within the Trinity would rival the Father, personhood would be undermined. And this is not a nominalist point. I actually am fully in line with St. Maximus' teaching about nature, logi, the reality of, let's say, conceptual things being ontologically real. Um, I'm not saying that because there is a distance between creation and creator, that creation cannot image God fully. What I'm saying is that there is a performative aspect going on. So God does not endure iniquity for iniquity's sake or to satisfy an abstract sinless penal standard, but rather God endures the fruit of his perfect standard, the fruit being the cross, which contains within itself the possibility of repentance within it. I mean, the cross is downstream from God's desire for creation to be free to choose him or not. It is not a necessary outcome of it, but it is, let's say, downstream from it. Christ's passion on the cross affords reality. It affords God as judge to test and rule over reality imagistically. but it's not the source of his authority. By accepting the cross while being truly sinless, Christ expresses his divine right to be the judge, because he expresses the union between the standard of the world and his. And by imaging this joining of both standards, the divine standard and the world's standard, he symbolically subsumes the world's standard to his. But while there are mystical processes occurring during the crucifixion, God doesn't earn his sovereignty on the cross. The world standard was already subsumed, or rather, God's sovereignty was never in question. Not really. And some of the poetic aspects of what the fathers say when they say that God created the world on the cross, they're speaking about God's nature, God's character, but they're not saying that the cross was necessary nor that God was forced to somehow, let's say, follow his own uh, rules in order to not be incoherent. Like I said, there are mystical aspects of all of this that are preceded and others that are achieved on the cross. But God was the true ruler of the world before the crucifixion. Or would we say that the devil was the sole ruler of the world at any one point? No. The crucifixion condenses a lot of things, maybe everything, into one point, one symbol. But God's being is not established on the cross. On the contrary, the cross flows from God's being, and it was not necessary. On the one hand, the symbol of the cross is mystically linked to the proper sacrifice of both divine and human nature and the presentation of deified human nature back to the Father. But to point at just one example, Christ's union of the divine and human nature was already achieved in the incarnation. And ontologically speaking, it could be argued that human nature was in God's nature even before the incarnation, even if not joined like the incarnation reveals, because this was already part of God's plan. And let's put to the side everything that has to do, let's say, with sacramental reality, because the crucifixion is an offering, in a sense. Perhaps the offering. It is an image of sacramental reality. So the symbol of the cross is necessary for us to know him, to reveal him, and mystically for our communion to him to be possible, but not to unite himself to human nature as such. That also parallels, let's say, our relationship to liturgy and our call to be Christ in the world. Like we're not Christ just, we're not part of God's body just when we commune, but rather we commune when we do Christ's will on earth. So the symbol of the cross is necessary for us to know him, to reveal him to us, and mystically for our communion to him to be possible, but not to unite himself to human nature as such, like I said. He could have destroyed everything and started over. He was not forced either to be crucified, nor to create, nor to join himself to creation. He wasn't forced to create. These mystical processes were done as acts of love to unite himself to the particular creation that he loved, to us in our personal being. It is a choice born out of God's love. It is not a necessary condition of God. God was not forced to love us. The cross is our redemption in the sense that the cross is the only way for us in our faulty human nature to be restored and reconciled both with God and also to our own human nature, which was already prefigured and created in the image and likeness of God, born into divinity by participation. Christ is the best lamb that is sacrificed for the prodigal son return. For the prodigal son's return, I'm referring to this parable because I think Christ is always, let's say, playing that role within his Father's kingdom. Christ is also the law, the embodiment of the law and the fulfillment of the law, meaning both the law and the spirit of the law. And what is the law without the Father? What is the law without the Spirit? what is the image without the personhood of God? That's why Christ is humble and meek, because he always serves his Father by making himself nothing in order to do his Father's will. Even in that parable, look at how, from the lens I just offered, Christ does not put himself in the position of the Father, but takes the place of the Lamb. The symbol dies to itself in order for the meaning to be conveyed. That's how it avoids becoming an idol. Otherwise, it would be the tyranny of the law. It would be a usurpation of the Father by Christ. To close the Christological point, God dies on a cross for the possibility of salvation for all of us. And in a particular sense, not to satisfy the Father's desire for restitution in regards to full payment for our sins, which God would forgive if we repented, and which is a debt beyond our ability to repay, but to protect his people from the effects of sin. That's the reason. Sin. It is in that sense, the sense of protecting his flock from sin, protecting the dignity of man, protecting the dignity of creation, that he wills hell as a possibility. Yes, he sends people to hell. He accepts some to be tormented eternally. This is not sadistic. God is not evil. But this shows a God who revealed the way to its fullness for the salvation of all. After such a revelation, those who choose something else choose damnation unto themselves. The reason hell exists is to protect the integrity of the church as distinct from the unrepentant world. It is something that God accepts, not because he desires that some be damned as punishment for their debts, which he could erase easily, but because on the one hand they cannot participate in the kingdom, but also on the other, because otherwise there could be no salvation for the repentant world, for the church. If God did not separate the goats and the lambs, the mixture would destroy the lambs. The goats would slaughter the lambs and sin would infect everything. Paradise would not be possible. The issue most people have with such a formulation is an idol of God that leads to an inability to distinguish what exactly the church is. They have a view of sin that is sub-Christian. They view sin in a penal way instead of an infection that destroys the body. It is not only an ecclesiological issue or a hamartiological issue, but fundamentally a Christological one. These people say that God's desire for man's salvation would be against God's will, that there would be a place like hell. But these two, they are not contrary to each other. It's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of hierarchy. God prioritizes his people over unrepentant sinners. There is nothing in the tradition that says otherwise. And I'm speaking now about, let's say, the eschatological reality. It's not that just because you're going to be a Christian, God is going to favor you in the world. It rains both on the just and the unjust, and of course there is a danger of Phariseeism, but you have to look at this through the lens of eternity, not through the lens of the world. There is nothing in the tradition that says otherwise. When people say, but God supped with sinners. Yes, but God did not eat with the Pharisees. This misrepresentation of the tradition is leading to huge problems because of a lack of resolution, because we need a philosophical articulation of these matters. So to go back to my initial caveat in regards to Jonathan Pajot's claim that the world is symbolic, take all of this with a grain of salt, by the way. I might sound like I'm being perhaps too taxing in my critique, but listen to what I say and try to have a little bit of charity. Yes, Christ is the light of the world, and he is the proper lens through which to understand the world. These two are synonyms. In that sense, the world is truly symbolic. Christ is the true ruler of the world. But it's not just symbolic, because symbols also break down and betray their purposes, and in this fallen world there is a distance between man and God that needs to be acknowledged performatively. We cannot know symbols and the essences of things as such. Symbols do not create the world. It is not by symbolizing that ontological reality is achieved. That would elevate the law over the Father and the body over the Spirit. And like I said, it would mean that liturgy could force God to be present. It would mean magic, idolatry. Christ is a person before he is a symbol. And there is a mystical transcendent aspect of personhood that is always beyond being symbolized. By upholding the inherent essentialist claim that Christ is the symbol of symbols to highlight how it is possible to know Christ in this manner, we give symbols power to sacramentally judge or alter reality. We end up granting ourselves mastery over these symbols and fall into the very same kind of idolatry that semioticians like Umberto Eco warned and wanted to escape from. We become totalitarians, we become magicians who use symbols to bend reality to our will because we assume that our symbolic understanding is perfect. We make an idol of God and introduce a separation between the Father and the Son by elevating the Son in order to elevate ourselves and elevate ourselves above both. It's a form of self-deification. So then the symbol becomes identical to what it symbolizes, and we forget the fall, God and man. It is a destruction of hierarchy that identifies itself with the source of identity. It is Satanism itself. Personhood is a very mystery that escapes being symbolized and transcends all. Christ is the light of the world, but he transcends the world. So for the world to image Christ, the very limits of the world must remain unknowable to us and must also be transcended. Because to limit the world, to encode or symbolize reality, would be usurping God and defining him as well. It would be a rejection of our own humanity. By disrespecting the vastness of the world, we disrespect Christ. And by, I would add, also reducing Christ to a manifestation in the world performatively, we would be doing the same to Christ. We would be disrespecting him and disrespecting the dignity that the created world has to image the transcendent. So, while the postmodern temptation that thinkers like Eco fall into is not the right solution because it leads to relativism and to disdain towards the Christian story, something in it is healthy. When I speak about, for example, the ability of the created world to image the transcendent, I'm not talking about the image encapsulating the transcendent, if it makes any sense. It's talking about a sort of relationship that the world bears with the transcendent that is necessary and necessarily somewhat incomplete, somewhat unfinished. Someone would always have to like recognize a distance inherent between creation and the transcendent. And the distance is not covered without God in a, let's say, rationally apprehensible manner. But if it is covered at all, it is in God by participation. And this is the key to participation. Even though we could and should understand the epic symbolism in our story so that we might be good Christians, still God's being is forever distant, and our knowledge of these symbols cannot be applied systematically. This is not just a restatement of God's essence being unknowable to us, but highlighting that an aspect of God's energies are mysterious to us as individuals as well, because we're limited, that we do not participate in all of God's energies, that we do not even understand them, and that we couldn't even recognize them properly. Only God knows all ends. So it is in that manner that the world, even though it is called to image God, at the very least cannot be said to be truly symbolic as long as the fall, as long as the devil, as long as the devil rules some of it, as long as we must work and struggle towards salvation. And even then, we could never claim to be able to symbolize God or the world, or else we would fall again like Adam and Eve. That's exactly the problem with pride. It's not that the church is not Christ on earth. It's not that we cannot consider ourselves to be Christians. It's not that we cannot consider ourselves to be acting on behalf of Christ, is that we have to be able to recognize that we're not capable of imaging Christ always, at all times, that our symbols bear a distance or may bear a distance with God. The world is not symbolic because even if there is a method in the breaking of a symbol, even if we could analyze the particular ways in which something falls and how it compares to a story, which is not trying to dig at Peugeot, but actually critiquing the way that he sets up the fact that from him, like, you can always see things through the lens of Christ, or should be able to see the things that happen in the world through the lens of Christ, even if there is a method in our madness. God is the only truly symbolic being, the only true source of unity. And if the world were truly symbolic in itself, then the world would be equal to God. It would be apprehending the transcendent perfectly. It is because God is symbolic and beyond symbolic that we know that He is above and beyond us, that He is personal, self sustaining, and infinite. He is being whose essence is to us divine darkness. He is that He is being beyond being. And for the world to be symbolic and divinized, it must also share somewhat in aspects of God's transcendence, beyond symbolism, or rather, symbolism is never just symbolism. Symbolism is not exhaustible. Symbolism cannot be truly, in that sense, exhaustive. It is in transcendence that symbolism breaks from becoming self-reflective and self-referential, complete unto itself. The language of man cannot equal the language of God. There are many languages, and in that multiplicity, God expresses himself. So transcending symbolism becomes the only true possibility for communion, the transcendent aspect becoming guarantor of the main precondition for communion to be achieved: difference. And by difference, I mean difference that is still within God, difference like between man and woman. It's like, I will never be able to truly know what it is to be a woman, but we can both know God fully to the extent that our natures and that our shared natures allow us. So we're talking about difference that is recapitulated within God. And this is basically an image of the Trinitarian relationships. That's why our God is triune and not a simple essence. The unknowing, the recognition that there is an other, something as another that is not a direct extension of ourselves, and which means that there is an other part within the same body, becomes the only possibility to know. Or else, without a difference, communion would be presupposed and never truly achieved, and confusion would be the only possible outcome. There would be no participation possible because there would be no distinct parts, and this is the essence of Satanism. Creation making itself equal to the Creator, the part making itself equal to the whole, and recognizing no other parts. So instead of a Trinity, it's just oneness, complete oneness, absolute divine simplicity. Western society hates hierarchy, tradition, and true authority because it doesn't know how to deal with difference, and because they restrain absolute freedom. That's why it wants absolute freedom without consequences. It has to imagine that there are no consequences instead of being one body. It chooses death over participation. So most of the West hates God even as it pretends to worship him by undermining worldly hierarchy. The role of restraining lawlessness, and this is more of a political point, but it flows from what was just explored. This is a political philosophy channel after all. I'm not like an expert theologian. Lord have mercy if I ever believe myself to be a role model. The role of restraining lawlessness was given to political authorities, not to be contested by popular acclaim, redefining justice perpetually, but to serve God's justice, precisely to prevent people from falling into idolatry and worshiping themselves. The war against the strong ruling over the weak for the sake of the weak, which was virtue originally. Egalitarianism that presupposes to weaken the strong to equalize everyone is nothing short of Satanism trying to blur the salvific distinctions that the church has always defended and which allow community and communion to be possible. By sowing this confusion, the devil means to destroy even those who would be elect. It is a direct assault against the church which alone stands against it. Who would stand against the blurring of boundaries when society itself became relativistic? Only strong men could. Relativism itself is a satanic disease meant to kill its host by ripping apart its body. Beyond what people espouse as intellectual frames, which are not unrelated to what they do, we see that secular society's actions damn it and rip it apart. It is in that sense that the role of the restrainer cannot be fulfilled while the people worship at the altar of democracy. Our kingdom is not of this earth, but while on earth, we're called to manifest it to the degree that we can, knowing our limits, which are unavoidably there. Those who, in an attempt to seem pious and humble, and to humble others, dissuade everyone to act, those who call them to put blinders and ignore the fact that we are called to act in this world, that the political is important for the communal, for worldly justice to be a part of our experience, and who claim that it is nothing, who deny that a form of society is a necessary ingredient for the church's very being, and that the church is itself a society that images Christ and ought to be just. These are Gnostic enemies of the church dressed as lambs. They are wolves pretending to be pious and humble. They would have a church without Christ, and the salt of the earth would lose its saltiness. We're to be the salt of the earth until the very end, and we cannot let others blur the boundaries of the church. Hell exists precisely because of it, and those who would speak against the doctrines of hell or against necessary distinctions speak against the church, which has spoken about all of these things at length. The only service I can provide is to try to articulate what has already been said, hopefully for me to understand it in my own heart, and if it helps other people, so much the better. So glory to God for all things. I hope that you found this helpful, and I apologize I haven't been able to produce more content, but it's because I'm pivoting towards other activities that seem to me more salient. Thank you for listening, for taking your time, and God bless.